question is illicit income flows and the collapse of customs, which, by the way, then perverts all sorts of equal playing field for goods and services coming into South Africa. All of that, they've now suggested that they are going to actually look at. And if you ask me, where do I think the broader tax gap is? I think it's in 2 or 3 areas, and we need to deal with that properly. The first would be base erosion and profit shifting, transfer pricing, and similar activities. How do I know that that is a problem? I know that's a problem because about 10 years ago, when SARS had a proper transfer pricing unit, and they just audited 40 companies seriously, and they knew what they were doing, they collected R1 billion that they didn't think they would collect. I also know that because of the comparative research. The comparative research, the US Bureau of Statistics, if you take their research and what has been followed up by a whole series of academics and some really interesting stuff, indicates that 40% of the profits of US multinational corporations are diverted to tax havens and low tax jurisdictions. 40%. And that's not only true of US multinationals. So you have to capacitate a sophisticated unit to deal with this problem, because there is no doubt about it, through a series of tax techniques. Most important these days, the way in which you price intellectual property and suck profits out by way of royalties, also by marketing and legal fees, and also by rather cruder versions of overpricing certain inputs so that you actually suck the profits out. All of these are now a fundamental problem for all countries, which is why the OECD was so concerned about it, but we aren't able to deal with that because we don't really have at this moment a transfer pricing unit that works. I'm not entirely sure, ladies and gentlemen, that the report that you might have seen published in the Business Day of some research done on the transfer pricing, which indicated very significant hemorrhaging, is utterly accurate. But there is no doubt that that is a pressure point that we have to deal with. I have little doubt that that is true as well of significantly high net worth individuals. Sometimes I look at the tax tables and ask myself, people earning over 5 million rand, you get very few on the tax tables. And yet when I take a drive from here down towards Bryanston and I look at all these houses, right, I think, how is it possible to have such a large house, right, and not have a significant income? You can do the same trick in Bishop's Court, and you say, absent, of course, the ambassadors. And the question you've got to ask yourself is, what is going on here? And there is, I think, unquestionably, significant tax avoidance on that side. Now, we have had a series of amnesties. The last amnesty, which only brought in 4 billion. On my own calculations, and they weren't my calculations, they're calculations that we worked up by comparative figures of other countries which had the tax amnesties, our previous amnesty, and what we thought was out there by some extrapolation of the Panama and other papers. It indicated to me that we should have got in 16 or 17 billion and we only got in 4. So now what do? Well, my own view is you've got to capacitate SARS and people should go to jail. I really think enough's enough now. If you are found with serious trust that you think that you can be clever, that you put your daughter as a beneficiary because she lives in England, whilst you go to your fancy house in London, which is yours, I'm sorry. You've had your chances, and it's about time that we did something about that. But to do that, you've got to then recapacitate a whole series of institutions. Take BSASA. Yes. I know Mr. Agreezy came from the Hollywood casting studios. If Mario Puzo, who wrote The Godfather, had a figure called Mr. Agreezy, they would have said, no, that's not credible. But if you take BSASA and you look at what I'm talking about, if they were basically distributing 6 million rand of cash every month, where the hell did it all go to? And did some of it go through the banks? I mean, I can't believe, for example, that if it's true that Dudu Mayeni was getting 300,000 a month, and I stress, if it is true, then she just simply put it under a mattress. what I'm suggesting is that somewhere along the line, some of that must have appeared in some of the banking institutions. Now, I invite any of you to the tea break to take 10,000 or 20,000 rands in a suitcase and go to any bank now and see what happens to you. Right? Right? Now, so therefore, the question is, were the banks failing? Secondly, if the banks reported it, they would have reported to the Financial Intelligence Center. So did the Financial Intelligence Center sleep on the job? Or did they say to both SARS and the National Prosecuting Authority, we've got here a serious prima facie case of money laundering? And did they fail? Or did all four fail? Why am I mentioning this to you? Because you can see what I'm talking about capacitation. That unless you've got all of these institutions actually working in tandem with each other, you're going to have a huge hemorrhaging of tax. So that's the other factor. And illicit income flows, the same applies. So I think, and one of the things that we are going to do, since we've been asked to do it, is to actually now do a very sophisticated analysis. I'm not going to do it myself, I can't. What we're going to do is ask the World Bank and the IMF like we did previously. They did a very sophisticated econometric analysis about the extent of the tax gap for VAT. So what they did was they tracked what, in fact, the total kind of sales of goods and services on our national accounts were. They then looked at that. They essentially analyzed that as best they could, and then they asked themselves the question, well, how much are we collecting in terms of VAT to get a tax gap? Turned out, by the way, that the tax gap in South Africa for VAT was the lowest in the world at the time. Why? Because you only have one rate. You see, and zero rating. If you had anything more, you'd be in trouble, which goes back to why there's restrictions on the tax design. And this gentleman arrived, he was a mathematician from the IMF to explain this all to me. He was a Chinese gentleman, and I wondered whether, in fact, it was his English that I didn't understand, but I realized that he only spoke in algorithms. So I understood nothing, save for the results. Right? What I'm now looking to do is to do precisely the same on income tax. You can. And so what we need to do, in a sophisticated level, is to ask ourselves, what should we be collecting, other than the stuff that I've indicated to you now? Why aren't we collecting? What is the gap, and why is there a gap? And what I'm saying to you is, even at a 1.5% tepid growth rate, I'm convinced that there's more money there. Now, we'll get back to what they should do with the money in a moment. But I am trying to give you some sense of how one could design the system or reconfigure the system so that maybe we're not as gloomy as we should be. The second aspect to that is obviously then, what changes would you make in the tax system if you collected significantly more, if you got up to budget, if you collected 50, 60 billion? Well, here's what I would do. I would lower corporate tax. Right? I would try to lower corporate tax immediately to 25%, which I think is symbolically a really important sort of invitation to people to say, we're serious about wanting investors in South Africa. And by the way, as I keep on saying, unless we know what the effective corporate rate of tax is, it's actually difficult to actually know what to do, because the effective rate is definitely below 28%. So when you know what the effective rate is, then you can start getting some greater handle on how low you can go, because you want to get it in that room. That's what I would do. That's number one. Number two is, I think in the maximum margin rates of tax, there is definitely notwithstanding Trump, etc., there is definitely a lot of economic evidence to suggest that that there will be pressure, I think, in the world on income tax rates going up for very, very wealthy people. And not entirely wrongly. Inequality is now a major issue in the world, and you have to accept that. I do think, probably in VAT, it would be difficult to increase it above 15%. If you were going to do that, you'd have to think of a whole lot of imaginative ways to ensure that it was redistributed properly. And then I think, if you're going to do that, you probably do have to either revamp a state duty or have a very low-level wealth tax, because I think one of the important parts about South Africa is that tax is not only about tax is not just about efficiency, it's also about legitimacy. And you can't expect, and it's all very well, I did mention that 28% of income tax was paid for by people of 1.5 million. But it's also true that poor people, if you look at people between 350,000 to 600,000, not a hell of a lot of money, they're paying comparatively the same, which is a lot more for them. And of course, poor people pay VAT. And I don't think you can get away in a country with our starting levels of inequality, right, without doing anything on the wealth side. But here's the thing. You could do all of that. And as I said to the minister, and I'm happy to share it with you, if we had to have if you could call it a reconstruction dividend, and therefore had to put up tax by another 2%, and we ring-fenced the money, if you just take a hypothetical case, we ring-fenced the money went for infrastructure. And that money did not go into the National Revenue Fund, but went into some sort of kind of sovereign fund type scenario. Then I actually think people probably would pay if they knew that the money wasn't going to go to Bosasa and they knew that the money was going to go to the building of infrastructure. And I think we've got to change our economic discourse to start talking about that. Right? We've got to, in other words, we may not need to do that because maybe we can get out of the hole for the reasons I've advanced. But what I am saying is, part of the problem that we've got is the expenditure side and the corruption side. And you can't have a tax system, however imaginative, when the levels of corruption continue to be as they are.